The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The dining room on Cloud City smelled like expensive air. That was Han's first thought when the doors hissed open. Recycled atmosphere run through filtration systems that cost more than the Falcon, scrubbed clean of anything real. The specific antiseptic luxury scent of a place built for people who had never needed to worry about what they were breathing. Warm, amber light. A table long enough for a banquet. Chairs that cost more than his ship. His hands already knew something was wrong. They always did. His brain was still processing the walk through the corridors, the escort, Lando's carefully arranged smile that kept slipping at the edges like a mask applied with the wrong adhesive. His hands had already finished that calculation 3 minutes ago and arrived at an answer his brain hadn't caught up to yet. They were moving before he was. The door hissed open. Darth Vader was standing at the head of the table, not seated, not waiting like a host, standing exactly in the center of the room's sightline, the way a man stands when he has arranged himself to be the first thing seen. The black armor absorbed the amber light and gave nothing back. The breathing, that mechanical, rhythmic, inorganic sound that Han Solo had spent years hoping never to hear at close range, filled the room the way a heartbeat fills a chest. Constant, certain, the sound of something that did not stop. His gloved hand was already beginning to rise. He had sensed it. The draw, the decision, something below the level of Han's conscious thought. Vader had read it before Han's fingers had finished closing around the grip. The hand came up, the Force moving ahead of physics, the most dangerous reflex in the galaxy executing in real time. Han's hand was already moving. No speech. No threat. No moment of dramatic confrontation where two men locked eyes and made choices. Just two hands in motion and the single, absolute question of which one arrived first. Something happened inside Vader's skull. The narration cannot show it on his face, because there is no face to show. But for one fraction of a second, half a heartbeat, less, the rising hand slowed. Something slammed into his awareness from the direction of the Bespin upper atmosphere, through the Force, at the specific frequency of desperate arrival, Luke Skywalker, punching out of hyperspace above the cloud layer, his presence hitting Vader's Force awareness like a struck bell in a sealed room. Not subtle, not a gentle ripple. A shockwave of urgency and fear, and the reckless love of someone flying toward danger, because the alternative is not flying at all. The hand was half a second slow. Han's bolt went under the rising palm. The sound of contact was not what anyone in that room expected. Not an explosion, not a dramatic detonation. A sharp crack, and then a sizzle. Brief and specific. And then silence. The mechanical breathing stopped. In a room that had been underscored by that sound from the moment the doors opened, its absence was louder than anything. Vader looked down. The chest box housing sparked. Once, twice, a thin curl of smoke rose from the point of impact, and the electronics inside, the pump, the processor, the medication lines. The 23 years of careful pharmacological management of a body that should have died on Mustafar went quiet in sequence, one component after another, like lights going out in a building at the end of the day. The slight tilt of his helmeted head conveyed something that had never existed in the public record of Darth Vader, something close to bewilderment. The posture of a being confronting an event that his entire existence had classified as outside the category of possible things. His knees buckled. Then he went down. The Dark Lord of the Sith was on his knees on the floor of a Cloud City dining room, and the galaxy would never be the same. The stormtroopers did not fire. There were 12 of them. Blasters raised, fingers resting against triggers, combat training executing at the level of reflex, and then stopping. Because the training had a gap in it. The training had always had a gap in it, because the men who wrote the Imperial military's tactical protocols had never once, in the entire history of those protocols, written a contingency for this. The supreme commander of the Imperial fleet does not go down to a blaster bolt from a smuggler. That scenario existed in no manual, no briefing, no field command simulation ever run in the history of the Empire. Their fingers rested against the triggers and found no instruction waiting for them there. They held. Boba Fett's hands were still. His visor was pointed at Han Solo, steady and patient, and behind it something efficient was happening. A man repricing a contract in real time, running variables, clearing the board and rebuilding the calculation from the ground up. The original contract, Solo, alive, in carbonite, delivered to Jabba. The room's current state, Vader on his knees, chest box destroyed, stormtroopers frozen. The entire authority structure of this encounter collapsed in a single second. Firing at Solo risked hitting Vader. Firing at the Wookiee risked a closed-room firefight where the variables no longer ran in Fett's favor. Fett did not fire at situations where the variables did not run in his favor. He watched. From the floor, through the ruined housing of the chest box, something terrible was trying to happen. The emergency reservoir in the helmet was cycling. Passive oxygen. Not the pump. Not the mechanical respiration that had been the baseline of Vader's existence for 2 decades. And the sound that escaped was the worst sound Han Solo had ever heard. Not the breathing of a machine. The wet, ragged, horrifying sound of a man's damaged lungs discovering they had to work without assistance, and beginning to fail at it. Darth Vader was gasping. Han's brain caught up to his hands. He did not think about what he was doing next. Thinking about it would have taken too long and arrived at the wrong answer. He opened his mouth, and the words came out of somewhere below the level of thought. The part of him that had kept him alive in 12 systems and a dozen situations stupider than this one. Chewie, grab him. Chewbacca's roar of bewilderment filled the room. Not protest, not yet, but the specific vocalization of a being whose processing capacity had just been exceeded by a single instruction. Han could hear the exact shape of the confusion in it. He did not have time for the confusion. Grab him. We're leaving. Chewbacca crossed the room in 4 strides. The physical reality of what happened next was this. 240 kilograms of Wookiee, moving at full speed, reached down and took the Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet by the collar of his armor and hauled him over one massive shoulder. The motion was not gentle. It was not designed to be. It was the motion of someone who had been told to grab something and was grabbing it. Vader's gauntleted hands came up and found Chewbacca's arm. They could not grip. The armor was designed for combat, not for the specific motion of a man trying to claw his way off a Wookiee's shoulder, and the gauntlets found fur and found nothing. His hands scraped. Fell, scraped again. The sound escaping the mask was irregular now, each breath a separate effort. The helmet's reservoir fighting to compensate for a pump that was gone. Han was already moving. His blaster found Lando Calrissian in the time it took to turn around. Lando's face in that moment carried everything about him at once, the betrayal he'd made and the specific shape of the guilt that had been gnawing at him since he'd made it, and layered over both of those. The very particular terror of having Han Solo's weapon in his face, which was different from all other weapons because Han Solo had just done something completely insane and there was no reasonable expectation about where it stopped. "Move," Han said. "Don't look at them. Move, Han. They'll what, Lando?" A single glance back. At Chewie's shoulder. At the armored figure hanging over it with hands that couldn't hold anything. "They'll shoot? At him?" Lando moved. They ran. The stormtroopers followed, every one of them blasters raised, boots hammering the amber corridors of Cloud City in full pursuit, and not one of them fired. The visual was almost incomprehensible, an entire Imperial garrison running after a smuggler and a Wookiee carrying their supreme commander, and every finger staying off every trigger, because nobody had authorization. And nobody was going to be the soldier who put a bolt through Darth Vader, trying to stop a man Darth Vader could crush with a thought on any other day in the history of the galaxy. The corridors blurred. Behind them, in the dining room, the sparks from the chest box housing died one by one. Boba Fett stood in the silence. He looked at the scorch mark on the floor where Vader's knees had made contact. He looked at the stormtroopers who were no longer in the room. He looked at the doorway through which the most unprecedented thing he had ever witnessed in a professional career spanning 2 decades had just departed. He raised his comlink. His voice was flat, entirely professional. The voice of a man for whom this was a problem with a solution, not a catastrophe without one. "This is Fett. I need a new contract." The corridors of Cloud City were built for elegance. wide enough for two administrators' aides walking side by side, polished durasteel walls catching the amber light from recessed fixtures, the faint hum of atmospheric processors, keeping the air at precisely the temperature a tourist found comfortable. Tasteful, considered, the architecture of a place that had never expected to host this. Chewbacca's boots hit the floor like hammer strikes. The armored weight on his shoulder made no sound except the wrong kind of breathing, wet, irregular, a rhythm with no confidence behind it. Each inhale a question the body was not sure it could answer. Han was 3 steps ahead, blaster up, Lando a half step behind with his hands visible and his expression doing something complicated between calculation and shame. The first stormtrooper they came around the corner was alone. He saw them. His weapon came up. His eyes went to the Wookiee's shoulder and found what was there. His weapon stayed up. He did not fire. They went around him like water around a post. 3 more at the next junction. Same result. Blasters tracking, training executing to the letter, and then the letter ran out, because the letter had never covered this. Han could see the exact moment each one of them hit the gap in their programming. The slight pause. The weapon that stayed raised but never moved past raised. Eyes going to the figure on Chewie's shoulder with the specific look of beings who were recalibrating their entire understanding of what the universe would and would not allow. Han had been shot at in 12 systems. He had never been not shot at in a way that scared him more than being shot at. Lando, flat, moving, docking bay. "You understand," Lando said, matching pace with the practiced ease of a man whose whole life was controlled chaos, "that when you leave, I'm the one who has to explain this." "Yeah." A corner taken at speed. Another pair of troopers, another frozen tableau, another gap in Imperial contingency planning that Han was actively grateful for. "You're good at explaining things." Han, docking bay, Lando. Lando's administrator codes were the only thing standing between the Falcon and the magnetic clamps that held her to the platform. Han knew this. Lando knew Han knew this. The negotiation was already over. They were just walking through the formalities of it at a run. The security terminal was 20 meters from the docking bay entrance. Lando put his palm against the reader. His voice, for the camera above the terminal, was the voice of a man performing normalcy under conditions that would have broken someone without his specific history of performing normalcy under impossible conditions. The clamps disengaged. The bay doors cycled open. Han moved the blaster from Lando's ribs for exactly 2 seconds, enough to be a gesture, not enough to mean anything, and then put it back. "That's it," Lando said. Not to Han. To himself, maybe. To the version of this situation he'd been running in his head since the dining room, the one where the accounting had to happen eventually. "That's all of it." "No," Han said. "That's the start of it. Get inside." Lando looked at the Falcon, at what Chewie was carrying, at the specific expression on Han's face that said the decision had been made in a room 30 seconds ago and was not going to be revisited. He got inside. The Falcon's cockpit was familiar in the specific way that familiar things are only fully felt when you've been away from them in a bad situation. Han dropped into his seat. His hands found the pre-launch sequence from memory, from 10,000 repetitions, from the bone-deep knowledge of a man who had been leaving places in a hurry on this ship for 15 years. Chewie secured Vader in the cargo hold. Han didn't ask how. He heard the sound of restraint bands, the magnetic click of cargo struts, and then Chewie's heavy footfalls coming forward to his seat. The engines caught. Outside, through the cockpit viewport, Cloud City's docking platform was filling with stormtroopers. A full garrison response, weapons up, forming a perimeter around a ship they had no authorization to fire on. An officer in gray, young, Han noticed, too young for whatever was happening to his career right now, was shouting orders into a comlink and getting nothing useful back from the other end. Han pulled the Falcon off the platform. She went like she always went, badly, then brilliantly, with a specific shudder through the frame that meant the port thruster was having opinions again. The city fell away beneath them. The orange cloud layer swallowed the platform and the garrison and the officer with his comlink. And then there was just the upper atmosphere. The sky going from gold to deep amber to the dark blue edge of space. In space above Bespin, Luke Skywalker had been there for 40 seconds. He'd come out of hyperspace alone, on instinct and a force pull that hadn't waited for logic. A vision. Or close enough. Wrong, wrong, wrong. His friends in danger. The feeling of something vast closing around them from a direction that had no coordinates. He'd flown the jump on calculations that R2 had flagged as incomplete, and he'd made anyway. What he was sensing now was not what he'd expected. There was Leia, her presence in the Force sharp and controlled and furious. The specific signature of someone running on adrenaline and will. There was Han. He was hard to read. Han always was, more feeling than signal, but the shape of it was survival urgent and moving fast. And underneath both of them, threaded through them, was something enormous and dark, and in a kind of pain that Luke had no reference point for. Not the cold, dark wall he'd felt in the Force since the first time he'd become aware of Vader's existence. Not the immovable, architectural darkness of the Empire's hand. Something older than that. Something that had been built on grief and was showing its foundations for the first time. And it was reaching. Toward him. Specifically, unmistakably, toward him. Luke tried his comlink, got static, the Imperial garrison's jamming array, still running even with everything else falling apart down there. He pointed his X-wing at the Falcon's thruster signature and burned his engines. He had no idea what he was flying toward. He went anyway. The TIE fighters came out of the Star Destroyers in orbit like a kicked nest. 3 Imperial capital ships holding position above Bespin, their bridges full of officers who were waiting for an order that required authorization from a chain of command that had just lost its top link. Every senior officer on every bridge was looking at every other senior officer. The order to scramble came from a lieutenant. Han would learn this later. Second-hand. From someone who thought it was funny, a lieutenant who would be court-martialed for the unauthorized decision before the court-martial became irrelevant. Pursue. Disable only. Do not destroy. The TIEs poured out. Han looked at them on the sensor screen, counted, made the calculation that pilots make when the calculation is not actually a calculation but a commitment. Chewie was already in his seat, already running the nav computer, already doing in parallel what Han was doing in sequence, because that was what 15 years on this ship together looked like from the inside. The Falcon ran. She was not built for this. Technically, she was built for cargo and for the specific kind of speed that comes from illegal modifications by a man who treated engineering specifications as opening positions in a negotiation. The TIEs were faster in a straight line. The Falcon was never in a straight line. Han flew her the way he flew everything, through the gaps, around the geometry, using the inertia of the pursuing fighters against their own formation. 2 TIEs overshot on a banking cut. One clipped a third trying to correct. The nav computer beeped. Ready? Han said. Chewie said what Chewie always said, which was not yes but was exactly yes. The Falcon hit hyperspace. The stars became lines. The lines became nothing. The TIEs scattered behind them, their approach vectors ending in empty space, their target gone in the specific way things go, when they are in hyperspace, and you are not. In the sudden quiet that followed the jump, every sound the Falcon made could be heard at full volume. The hum of the drive settling into cruise, the rattle of the hull around the starboard access corridor that Chewie had been meaning to fix since Ord Mantell, the knock from the port thruster that had opinions in atmosphere, and had not stopped having them. And under all of it, from the cargo hold, through the floor and the walls and the recycled air of the ship, traveling the way sound travels on vessels where nothing is properly insulated, the sound of someone trying to breathe. Han stared at the hyperspace tunnel. The blue-white light played across the console, across his hands, across the sensor screens showing empty space behind them because there was nothing behind them now except distance. He did not move for a long moment. Then, very quietly, to the cockpit and to Chewie and to whatever version of the universe had decided to make this his problem. Chewie. We have a problem. Behind the Falcon's position, an X-wing punched into hyperspace in her wake. Its pilot had no destination. He had a direction, a feeling, and the specific certainty of someone who has learned to trust the thing he cannot explain. He followed the sound he couldn't hear yet. Hyperspace made the Falcon smaller. It always did, technically, the tunnel outside the viewports doing something to the perception of interior space. The way confinement felt more total when there was nowhere to go and nothing outside to measure distance against. But right now the ship was small in a way that had nothing to do with physics. The cargo hold was 8 meters by 6. The corridor leading to it was 1 person wide. The ceiling was low enough that Chewbacca had to angle his head in the doorframe. 8 meters by 6, and in the center of it on the floor, Darth Vader was dying by degrees. Han stood at the hold's entrance and ran the math. Not emotional math. He didn't have time for emotional math. And emotional math had a way of arriving at answers that got people killed. Operational math. The kind he'd been doing since he was 17 on a Corellian freight run that went wrong in 3 different directions before breakfast. What do I have? What do I need? What's the gap between them, and what fills the gap? What he had: a jury-rigged freighter, a Wookiee, a former Imperial city administrator, with guilt written across his face like graffiti, and the supreme commander of the Imperial fleet, in active mechanical failure on the cargo hold floor. What he needed: a dead Vader, meant the Imperial fleet had no reason to keep them alive. It meant the Empire could classify this as an isolated incident, a weapon malfunction, a rebel assassination, anything that let them contain the narrative. It meant the most valuable bargaining chip in the history of any rebellion in the history of the Republic turned into a body they'd have to explain. A living Vader meant something else entirely. The math was not complicated. The math was, in fact, the clearest math Han Solo had run in years. He moved before he finished thinking it. Chewbacca was already in the hold. He had set Vader against the cargo strut, carefully Han noticed, which was its own kind of information about Wookiees, and was crouched over the destroyed chest box with the expression he wore when the Falcon's hyperdrive gave out in deep space. Not panic. Assessment. His hands moved across the housing with the specific deliberateness of a being who has learned that touching things wrong costs time you don't have. He found the edges of the breach, measured it with his fingers, opened the panel beneath and looked at what was left of the components inside. Han watched him work and did not interrupt. Interrupting Chewie mid-assessment was like interrupting a calculation mid-digit. You didn't save time. You just introduced error. Chewie rumbled, turned, made 3 specific gestures at Han that translated, in the shorthand of 15 years, to emergency locker, medical kit, fuel line repair kit. Now, Han went. The emergency locker was in the corridor outside the hold. Han had the door open in 4 seconds, and was pulling contents onto the floor with both hands. Signal flares, a thermal blanket, the portable oxygen canister required on all vessels with a crew of 3 or more per Imperial safety regulations. A defibrillator unit in a yellow case with a cracked corner where Chewie had dropped it on Florum 3 years ago and never replaced it. He looked at the defibrillator for half a second. He took it back to the hold. The atmospheric feed tube was 2 meters of flexible conduit from the emergency oxygen supply kit, standard aboard every vessel in the fleet, for exactly the reason that atmospheric systems sometimes failed in deep space. Chewie cut it to length with a hydro spanner blade, precise and quick, no wasted motion. The mask's secondary intake port was on the lower left assembly. Chewie found it by feel, fingers tracing the housing until they found the recess, the specific depression in the metal that an Imperial technician would have located with a schematic. Chewie located it with 20 years of fixing things that weren't designed to be fixed in the field. He spliced the conduit in with a compression joint from the fuel line repair kit. Not airtight. Close enough. He opened the oxygen canister valve. The hiss was quiet, functional, and then Vader's breathing changed. Not better, not easy. Nothing approaching either of those things, but regular. The mechanical pump was gone and would not come back, but the oxygen was flowing, and the lungs that couldn't work properly without assistance had something to work with. The sound was wrong, human and wet and effortful in a way that the mechanical breathing had never been. But it was there. The rhythm held. Chewie was already opening the defibrillator case. The cardiac assist subprocessor had misfired on impact, the chest box's secondary systems registering the electrical surge from the blaster bolt and responding with arrhythmia, the heart losing the precise augmented rhythm it had depended on for 23 years. The biomonitor from the medical kit read the signal. Chewie looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he modified the defibrillator's external contacts, grounding them to the suit's chest panel with electrical tape and a clamp from the toolkit, and set the pacing rhythm by the monitor's signal. Han crouched at Vader's shoulders and did not think about what he was doing. The first pulse fired. Vader's body convulsed. Not violently. The armor absorbed some of it. But the arms moved, and the helmeted head turned, and the sound from the mask was something Han was going to remember in the dark for a long time. Chewie adjusted the rhythm. His hands were steady. Second pulse. The monitor steadied. The cargo hold had no score, no dramatic swell. Just the sound of tools on metal, the sound of the oxygen hiss, the sound of Chewie's breathing and Han's breathing, and the wet, effortful breathing of the figure against the cargo strut, and underneath all of it, the Falcon's constant mechanical complaints. The drives, the rattle in the starboard corridor, the port thruster still having opinions at sublight speed. Vader was conscious for all of it. Han knew because the hands were moving. Intermittently, without purpose, the gauntleted fingers pressing against the floor and then releasing, not fighting, not reaching, but the involuntary motion of a nervous system that was receiving more information than it knew how to process. Without the medication delivery system, the body was broadcasting its complete accumulated signal, every cybernetic seam where metal met what remained of organic tissue, every interface point, every joint that had been maintained under chemical management for so long that the pain had ceased to be pain and had become background. The specific silence of something so constant you forget it's there. Until it wasn't there anymore. For the first time since the first morning he'd woken up in the suit on a medical table on Coruscant, Darth Vader felt Mustafar. All of it, at full volume, not memory, not abstraction. The present tense physical reality of what had been done to a body on a riverbank 23 years ago, arriving now without filtration or suppression, or any of the careful pharmacological distance the suit had been designed to maintain. The hands pressed against the floor. Released. Pressed again. He did not make a sound beyond the breathing. Han gave him that, registered it, filed it somewhere he'd think about later, and kept his hands on the armored shoulders, and kept them still. Leia was in the doorway. Han saw her in his peripheral vision and did not turn. She had been there for 10 minutes, maybe more. She had not moved to help and had not moved to leave, which was its own kind of answer about what she was doing. She was watching Vader's face, or the mask where a face would be. Her expression was not pity and was not triumph. It was something more honest and harder to name. The face of a woman who had carried the weight of 2 billion people for 2 years, who had organized her entire interior architecture around what this man represented, and who was now looking at him small, looking at him mortal, looking at him reduced to the same biological fragility as everyone he had ever killed. She did not know what to do with that. She stayed in the doorway. Eventually Vader spoke. The vocoder functioned. The audio system was separate from the chest box, drawing from the helmet's independent power cell, but the cadence was wrong. The deliberate weight, the theatrical pacing, the performance of Darth Vader that had terrorized fleet admirals and rebel commanders and anyone who'd ever stood in a corridor waiting for those doors to open. That performance was too expensive for a man spending everything he had on the simple mechanical problem of keeping air moving through damaged tissue. One word, not a question, despite its shape. Why? Han was still crouching at eye level with the mask. He had been in this position for several minutes now because getting up would require deciding what to do next, and he was not ready to make that decision yet. He looked at the mask. "Ask me when you're not dying," he said. Chewbacca stepped back. The job was done. Provisionally, artificially, held together with compression joints and electrical tape, and a defibrillator that had been dropped on Florum. But Vader's oxygen flowed. Vader's heart beat. The pain did not stop, would not stop, was in fact the one component of the situation operating at full capacity. Chewie wiped his hands on a rag. The gesture was mechanical, automatic, the thing a mechanic did after a job, the same motion he made after fixing the hyperdrive or patching the fuel coupling or rebuilding the motivator for the 6th time. Grease off the palms. Job complete. Next problem. Han looked at what they'd done. Then he stood up, walked to the corridor, and kept walking until he reached the cockpit. He dropped into his seat. The hyperspace tunnel ran blue-white ahead of him, indifferent, heading nowhere specific at the speed of everything. He had no idea where they were going. He just needed it to be somewhere that wasn't here. Docking an X-wing with a Corellian freighter in deep space was not elegant. It was a feat of pure piloting and a small act of the Force. Luke matching velocity by instrument and instinct simultaneously, R2 managing the docking collar calculations while chirping at a frequency that communicated professional anxiety, the Falcon's airlock grinding open under protest like something that had never been designed for this, and knew it. The seal took 3 attempts. The collar clamped on the 4th. The whole procedure took 11 minutes and felt longer. Luke stepped inside. The Falcon smelled like it always had, oil and ozone and something faintly burnt, the specific layered scent of a ship that had been running too hard for too long on repairs that were always almost enough. The corridor lights were on their dim setting, automated cycle. The ship creating its own version of night, in the absence of a star to orbit. It smelled like safety, for half a second. The smell of every time he'd been on this ship and been glad to be on it. Then he heard the breathing. Not the mechanical breathing. He'd been braced for that, had been feeling Vader's presence in the Force since before he'd matched velocity, the vast dark architecture of it. Diminished now, flickering at the edges in a way it never had before, but unmistakably there. He'd been prepared for the mechanical breathing. What he heard instead was human. Wet and irregular and working, the sound of damaged tissue doing a job it wasn't built to do without assistance. The sound of something alive that was spending everything it had on staying that way. Luke followed it to the cargo hold. The image took a moment to assemble into something his brain could accept. Darth Vader, Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet, secured to a cargo strut with restraint bands across the chest and shoulders. An oxygen conduit, running from a portable canister to the lower intake port of the mask. Held in place with what appeared to be a fuel line compression joint. A defibrillator unit modified into something unrecognizable, its external contacts grounded to the chest panel with electrical tape, firing at 2-second intervals. Luke could see the slight movement of the armor with each pulse, the body registering the external rhythm it was being given because it could no longer reliably produce its own. The mask looked back at him. The presence behind it reached. Luke felt it before he understood what he was feeling. A movement in the Force, from the direction of the figure against the strut, toward him specifically. Not threatening. Not the cold dark pressure of Vader's usual Force signature, the immovable weight of it. The sensation of standing too close to something vast and fully capable of ending you. This was different. This was old and damaged and reaching the way something reaches when it has been in the dark for a very long time and has stopped expecting an answer. Luke reached back. He didn't decide to. His hand didn't move. It wasn't a physical reaching. It was something below the level of decision, the Force responding through him the way it responded to things that needed responding to, and his body executing before his brain had finished the sentence about whether this was wise. He stood in the entrance of the cargo hold and reached back. The mask tilted, slightly 1 degree, the only acknowledgement available to a face that couldn't make expressions. Han's voice came from the corridor behind him. "Kid." Luke turned. Han was in the passage, arms crossed, wearing the expression he wore when he'd already had a conversation in his head, and knew how it ended. Leia was behind him. Her face was arranged, carefully, deliberately, in the specific way she arranged it when the alternative was something she wasn't prepared to let happen in front of witnesses. They moved to the cargo hold. All of them in the space at once, which made it considerably smaller. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Leia said, "He has to go to the Alliance." Her voice was calibrated, controlled in the way that expensive machinery is controlled, not naturally but through engineering, through the application of will to every component. She did not look at Han when she said it. She looked at Vader. Mon Mothma decides what happens. We deliver him and we let the Alliance decide. The political capital of producing Darth Vader as a prisoner, that's my point, Han said. Leia's eyes moved to him. I wasn't finished. You were making my argument. He's worth more alive than dead. Mon Mothma decides. I've been saying that since Bespin. I'm saying it because it's strategically correct, Leia said, with a precision that drew a clean line between her position and Han's. Not because of anything else. Sure, Han. I said sure. Luke said, both of you. They looked at him. Stop. He wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at Vader. He'd been looking at Vader since he walked in and he hadn't been able to stop. Something is happening here that neither of you can feel and I don't have the words for it yet. Luke. Leia began. I know what he is. Flat, clear, not a reassurance, a statement of fact delivered by someone who needed it acknowledged before the conversation could continue. I know what he did. I'm not asking you to feel what I'm feeling. I'm asking you to wait. The oxygen hissed. The cardiac pacer fired. The Falcon's drives hummed in the walls. Leia turned to face Vader directly. She had been avoiding the direct angle, had been looking at him from the peripheral position of someone who was in the room but not engaging, taking in information without making contact. Now, she faced him fully. The distance between them was 4 meters, and did not feel like 4 meters. He destroyed my world, she said. Not to Han. Not to Luke. Into the room, at the mask, at the presence behind it. You want to negotiate with the man who destroyed my world. Han, quietly, I want to survive the man who destroyed your world. There's a difference. Something moved through Leia's face. Not the controlled surface, underneath it, in the slight tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in her jaw. She turned away from Vader. She looked at the floor. And when she looked up again, something had come loose in her that the architecture of her composure had been holding in place. She said Alderaan. Not the word. The contents of it. She said her mother's handmaiden, who had taught her to braid before state functions, and had opinions about imported silk that she expressed at length. She said the librarian at the palace archives, old enough to have served her grandfather, who had been cataloging a collection of pre-Republic navigation charts and had shown Leia the progress every time she visited. She said her father's aide, a man named Selly, who had brought tea to late legislative sessions without being asked, because he'd noticed that Bail Organa worked better with something warm in his hands. She had been doing this since the Death Star. Finding faces in the number. Carrying 2 billion people required something to hold on to, and she had chosen to hold on to names. Specific names. Specific faces. Specific details that kept the number from becoming abstract enough to survive. She turned on Han. You're going to sell him, she said. Like he's cargo. Han looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger settled into the expression of a man saying something true that he wishes were otherwise. That's what he is right now, Leia. Vader said nothing. Throughout the argument he had remained against the strut, hands still against the floor, the mask facing whichever direction the current speaker occupied. Luke watched him the way Luke watched things he didn't understand yet, with the patient attention of someone who knew that understanding was coming and was willing to wait for it. In the Force, Vader was not the wall. He was something older and more complicated, a signal with interference, a presence that had been transmitting on one frequency for so long that the original signal underneath had become unreadable. And as Leia said her names, as she said Alderaan out loud into the cargo hold air, something in the Force around Vader shifted. Almost imperceptible. The interference changed character for just a moment, not cleared, not resolved, but complicated, the way a signal complicates when a second frequency moves beneath it. Luke filed it, said nothing. He crouched in front of Vader, eye level, the mask looking back at him from a distance of less than a meter, the oxygen hiss filling the space between them, the pacer firing its 2-second rhythm through the chest panel. Do you know who I am? The cargo hold held its breath. Yes, Luke's jaw tightened. One controlled breath. Then, do you know who she is? A gesture toward Leia, not looking away from the mask. Longer silence. The drives hummed. The pacer fired once, twice. Yes, Luke stood. He looked at the mask for another moment, and whatever he found there settled something in him that had been unsettled since he'd stepped aboard. He turned to Han and Leia. "Don't decide anything yet," he said. Han opened his mouth. "I mean it, Han." Han closed his mouth. Leia looked at Luke. Then at Vader. Then at the floor. Her hands were very still at her sides, the stillness of deliberate construction, each finger placed where she'd put it. She did not agree. She did not leave. In hyperspace, there was no night. The tunnel outside the viewports ran blue, white, and constant, indifferent to the ship's automated lighting cycle, indifferent to the biological rhythms of the crew inside. The Falcon dimmed anyway, sensors interpreting elapsed time, systems dropping to minimal draw, the ship creating darkness because the people aboard needed it even if the universe wasn't providing it. Chewie slept. Han could sleep anywhere, under any conditions, and chose not to. He was in the cockpit with the nav display showing a heading he hadn't fully committed to yet. Running fuel calculations that didn't require the concentration he was giving them. The numbers were fine. He knew the numbers were fine. He ran them again. Leia was in the bunk corridor. On her back, eyes open, looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone performing an extremely difficult calculation on a problem that had no clean solution. She had been there for 2 hours. She was very good at lying still. Luke was in the cargo hold with Vader. Nobody had planned it. Luke had gone to check on the oxygen canister. The valve needed monitoring, he'd told himself, which was true, and also not the reason he went. He'd sat down on a supply crate. The hold was dim, the single working light in the corner casting everything in low amber. The pacer fired its 2-second rhythm. The oxygen hissed. He had not left. Vader spoke first. The vocoder had settled into its jury-rigged register, functional but degraded, the theatrical weight of it gone, replaced by something that was almost cadence and almost wasn't. The performance of Darth Vader was simply too expensive. What remained was a voice that had forgotten, or was forgetting, what it had been built to project. He did not begin directly. He began obliquely, the way a man begins when he has been circling something for 23 years and approach is the only thing he still knows how to manage. He said the dark side was a country. He said this without metaphor. Or rather, he said it and the metaphor was so accurate that it stopped being a metaphor. A country with its own gravity, its own atmosphere, its own logic of causation that was internally consistent and externally incomprehensible. He had lived in it long enough that he had stopped remembering what the border looked like from the other side. The pain, he said, was changing something. Not the word clearly. He was precise about this. Precise in the way that people are precise when the wrong word would be a lie. Not clearly. Differently, pain was making him think differently. 23 years of the suit's pharmacological management, the suppressants, the regulators, the careful chemical distance between Darth Vader and what had made him, removed in a single second, and what remained was not a man thinking clearly. What remained was a man thinking without the filter, which was not the same thing, which was, in some ways, worse. He paused. The oxygen hissed. There were 2 children, he said. Luke went very still. He told it in pieces. Out of order, with gaps, the way a man tells a story he has kept under lock for so long that the organizational system has degraded along with everything else. Luke did not interrupt. He sat on the supply crate and listened the way he listened to things that mattered. With his whole body, the force open around him, taking in not just the words but the shape of what was between them. Padam Amidala. Senator, Naboo. He said her name once, at the beginning, and then did not say it again for a long time, referred to her obliquely, as she. The pronoun doing the work that the name had cost too much to keep repeating. The marriage. Said in 2 words, no elaboration, the fact delivered with the care of something that would break if handled wrong. The war. The prophecy. He said this with something in the vocoder that was not tone, exactly, but was adjacent to tone. The edge of a man revisiting a word that had organized 20 years of decisions and finding it smaller than he remembered, than he had needed it to be. The fear. He said this word, And the vocoder did something complicated around it. Not performed complication, the involuntary kind. The kind a voice does when the word is still live, still capable of detonating. He did not explain what the fear was. He did not need to. Luke felt it in the Force like a bruise. The choice on the Senate floor. He said it was not a choice, and then he said he would unmake it 1,000 times, and both things were true simultaneously, which was perhaps the most honest thing he said in the entire conversation. Mustafar, he said the word, and stopped. He did not say what happened there. He did not describe it. He said only, she died. And I did not. The pause after that sentence filled the cargo hold and the corridor beyond it, and kept going. Luke counted it in Falcon sounds, the drives, the rattle in the starboard passage, the pacer firing twice in the silence, the weight of surviving what should have killed you, carried for 23 years, present in one sentence without any of the weight being reduced by saying it. Then, she had twins. I did not know. I was told they died with her. Luke said, he lied. Yes, the word landed without drama, flat and absolute and 23 years in the making. Vader's masked face turned toward the doorway. Luke followed the angle. The corridor outside the hold was dark. The ship's automated cycle had taken the ambient lighting down to navigation minimum, the kind of dim that was technically lit and practically wasn't. Leia was standing there. She was not moving. She had been there long enough that her eyes had adjusted, long enough to have heard at least the last part of it. The twins, the lie, the silence that followed. Her face in the low light was unreadable in the specific way her face was unreadable when she was reading everything and processing it somewhere Luke couldn't follow. Vader looked at her for the first time without the apparatus of threat or calculation between them, without the dark side wall of his presence arranged for maximum effect. Without anything, in this moment, except whatever remained when all of that was stripped away by a blaster bolt and a jury-rigged oxygen line and 23 years of suppressed pain arriving all at once. The girl, he said. The vocoder, the 2-second silence, Padam's eyes. Leia did not move for a long time. The fury in her was architectural, built on the Death Star, and load-bearing ever since. The kind of anger that stops being anger and becomes structure, becomes the thing the rest of the building rests on. It was not gone. Nothing about this conversation had made it smaller. But she was standing in a dark corridor listening to a dying man say her mother's name, and the fury had encountered something it hadn't been designed to encounter. And it was holding its shape through sheer engineering. She walked into the hold. She stood in front of him. Not close, 3 meters. The distance of someone who has not decided whether to be in this room and is not pretending otherwise. She looked at the mask. The mask looked back. You destroyed my world, she said. Yes, Bail Organa, my father, is dead because of you. Yes, she let the silence hold. She was testing something, not him, but herself. The question of whether she could be in this room with this man while he agreed to these things, whether her architecture would hold the weight of him simply saying yes. It held. And you expect me to call you father? No, flat, clear, no hesitation, no softening. I expect nothing. I am telling you what is true, because it is the only useful thing I have left. The cargo hold breathed around them. Then Leia, very quietly, then tell me her name. Padam. Leia turned and walked away. Deliberately, not running, not retreating, walking with the controlled pace of someone making a decision with their feet because their voice was not available for it right now. Back to the bunk corridor, back to the ceiling she'd been looking at for 2 hours. She did not return. Han Solo had been in the corner of the cargo hold for the last 12 minutes. He had retrieved a hydrospanner from the supply locker 9 minutes ago. He had not used it. It was still in his hand. He was looking at it with the focused attention of a man who has found the hydrospanner very interesting for reasons that had nothing to do with the hydrospanner. He cleared his throat. He looked at Luke. He said, very quietly, I shot her dad. Luke looked at him. I shot her dad. Kid, Luke, on the supply crate, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has absorbed too many true things in too short a span. He's my dad, too. Yeah. A pause. The pacer fired. Han. Yeah. Go check on Leia. Han set the hydrospanner down on the nearest flat surface. He looked at Vader once, briefly, the look of a man acknowledging the existence of a problem he has decided to address later, and walked out of the cargo hold. Luke sat alone with Vader in the low amber light. The silence between them was different now, not empty, the silence after something large falls, the particular quality of air in a room where something irreversible has just been said. Luke, quietly, what was she like? And Vader began to speak, not about the galaxy, not about the Force or the war or the long machinery of everything that had gone wrong. He spoke about Padme Amidala, the way she read political dispatches with her feet tucked under her on the Senate apartment sofa. Some habit from childhood she'd never shed despite 20 years of public life. The arguments she won not through volume but through a moral clarity so precise it made the opposing position feel structurally unsound. The way she laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny, a laugh that arrived late, like she'd considered whether to allow it, and decided yes. He spoke for a long time, in the dim cargo hold of a battered freighter moving through hyperspace. For the first time in 23 years, Anakin Skywalker told his son about his mother. The Imperial Palace's inner sanctum was built for a man who understood that fear was architecture. Black stone floors, polished to the depth of standing water, walls that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, the room's dimensions unclear at the edges, the darkness not decorative, but functional. A space designed to make visitors uncertain where the room ended and the Emperor began. No windows, no external reference, only the controlled dark, and within it, very still, the Emperor. His eyes were closed. In the Force, he was not passive. He was never passive. The distinction between Palpatine at rest and Palpatine in motion was purely physical. His web of dark side influence extended from this room in every direction simultaneously, through the palace, through Coruscant, through the hyperspace lanes, touching every point where his architecture made contact with the living galaxy. A web so old and so vast that he had stopped feeling it as an extension of himself, and had begun feeling it as simply the world. He could feel Vader constantly. He had been able to feel Vader for 23 years, the dark star of him, unmistakable and inextinguishable, the single brightest point in the Emperor's awareness of the Force. The signal had changed over the decades, diminished after Mustafar, compressed by the suit, always present, but its fundamental character had been the same. Cold, contained, his, until now. The signal changed. It did not diminish. That would have been clean, interpretable, a data point with a single meaning. It complicated. The dark star flickered at its edges in a way it never had. Some fundamental property of its output altered at the source. The character of it shifting towards something the Emperor had spent 2 decades ensuring it never became. He opened his eyes. He reconstructed events in the time it took most beings to register that something had happened. A Corellian, the specific frequency of recklessness in the Force, had a regional signature that Palpatine had catalogued across 60 years of political intelligence. The Millennium Falcon, which he knew by its hyperspace signature from the Hoth Pursuit, from the Kessel records, from a dozen Imperial intelligence files that had been updated every time the ship appeared near anything that mattered. A shot at close range, the chest box, and beneath the surface reading of the event, the variables that mattered. Luke Skywalker. His Force presence above Bespin, that desperate, open, entirely unguarded arrival that had announced itself to every Force-sensitive being in the system. And alongside it, the warm twin signature that Palpatine had spent 23 years believing did not exist. A girl. Force-sensitive. Carrying the Skywalker bloodline in a frequency he recognized immediately. Because he had been watching for it in the galaxy's noise for 2 decades, on the theory that Vader's medical reports had been wrong. They had been wrong. His children, both of them, clustered around the fading signal of a Vader who was no longer transmitting as Vader. The Emperor sat in his sanctum and experienced something he encountered rarely enough that he took a moment to examine it, the sensation of a variable he had not calculated entering a system he had considered closed. Not fear. something colder and more precise. Offense, the specific affront of a 60-year architecture encountering a smuggler with a blaster. He examined the sensation. Then he set it aside, because it was not useful. The options arranged themselves without effort. A battle fleet to intercept the Falcon, rejected immediately. Luke and the girl could not be destroyed. Not yet. Not like this. Not as a side effect of a retrieval operation. The Skywalker bloodline was the most valuable variable in his remaining plans. Killing them now would be the error of a man who confused proximity to a problem with urgency about it. A recovery team for Vader? Possible. The mechanics were manageable, he had assets in the Bespin sector, a shadow hand wing that could be redirected within hours. The question was not operational. The question was whether recovery was desirable. He considered this with the care it required. Vader in contact with his children. Vader without the suit's medication system. Without the pharmacological management that Palpatine had spent 20 years calibrating, the careful chemical architecture that kept Anakin Skywalker's emotional capacity suppressed to the level of an instrument. Vader in pain. Real pain. The first unmedicated pain he had felt since the medical table on Coruscant. And pain had a way of clarifying things in the direction of humanity rather than power. Vader becoming Anakin was not a retrieval scenario. It was a contamination scenario. Anakin Skywalker was not useful. Anakin Skywalker had never been useful. He had been the raw material from which something useful had been constructed. And the construction had required the deliberate destruction of the man underneath. 20 years of careful, patient, pharmacological, and psychological engineering. The suit's limitations. The dependencies. The isolation. All of it designed to ensure that what remained of Anakin was not enough to interfere with what Vader had become. Contact with his children, unmedicated, in pain that was making him think differently, was potentially enough. The Emperor made his decision. Recover Vader if containment was feasible. If Vader had been turned, if the contact with his children had reactivated anything the engineering was meant to have permanently suppressed, execute him. The order was clinical. It did not require him to feel anything about it, which was convenient because he did not. He composed the instruction for his private contractor channel and transmitted it through the frequency that did not appear in any Imperial military communication log. Then, he sat very still in his dark room and began managing the consequences of a smuggler with a blaster, which was the most undignified sentence he had constructed in 60 years of power. Slave the First was running a transit corridor between Bespin's departure vector and the probabilistic cone Fett had narrowed from the Falcon's hyperspace signature. He had already run the contractor channel frequency before the Emperor's message arrived, because Fett did not wait for clients to identify opportunities. He identified them himself and priced them before the client knew they were buying. His transmission was brief. His terms: track and approach the Falcon using the trajectory signature from the Bespin departure, assess Vader's condition on approach. His price for recovery was triple the original solo contract, reflecting the operational complexity of extracting an armored life support system from a moving vessel with a hostile crew. His price for elimination, if the Emperor's assessment of the situation matched his own read of the variables, was 10 times standard rate, not because the kill was difficult, because this was a service that should be priced to reflect its gravity. Boba Fett had a professional philosophy about the relationship between price and significance, and eliminating the supreme commander of the Imperial fleet on the Emperor's orders was the most significant service the contractor market had ever generated. He was pricing it accordingly. The Emperor accepted without negotiation. The acceptance told Fett everything the message didn't say. A man who negotiated Fett's fees down by 15% on the Ord Mantell contract, who had haggled the Nar Shaddaa extraction to within 3 decimal points of Fett's walkaway number, had accepted 10 times standard rate without a counteroffer. The situation was not a retrieval problem. The Emperor already knew what the assessment would find, and was paying for the other service. Fett filed this information. It did not change his approach. He would assess, and the assessment would determine the service, regardless of what the client expected the assessment to find. He was a professional. Professionals did not allow client expectations to determine findings. He adjusted his trajectory cone and increased speed. In the sanctum on Coruscant, the Emperor extended his awareness outward. He touched the executor's bridge, Admiral Piet, competent and terrified in equal measure, waiting for orders that were not coming from the direction they always came from. He touched the 3-star destroyers holding position above Bespin, their bridge officers doing the same. He touched the sector moffs, the regional commanders, the dozens of senior officers who had organized their entire professional existence around a chain of command that ran through one man, and that man was currently breathing irregularly through jury-rigged tubing on a Corellian freighter. The grip was still there. The Empire was vast and inertial and would not fall today. Would not fall this year, would fight for years regardless of what happened on that freighter. But the grip was exerting effort now, and effort was a condition it had not operated under in a very long time. He reached further, through the hyperspace lanes, through the dark, toward the fading, complicated signal of Vader's presence. It reached back. Not toward him. The direction was wrong. The reaching he'd felt before, Vader's force presence extending outward, was oriented toward 2 specific warm signatures that were not Coruscant. That were not the Emperor. That were, with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, his children. The Emperor withdrew his awareness. He sat in the darkness of his sanctum, with his hands folded in his lap, looking at nothing, thinking about the specific engineering challenge of a man who had been constructed to serve and was currently, for the first time in 23 years, reaching in the wrong direction. He would need to be recovered. Or removed. The Emperor had built contingencies for both outcomes. He had built contingencies for everything, because contingencies were the product of patience. And patience was the one resource he had never run short of. He extended his awareness to the Shadow Hand wing and began the redirection. The dark side moved at his instruction, the way it always had, the way it always would. He was not afraid. He was, very quietly, working. The Falcon dropped out of hyperspace into the wrong kind of quiet. Han felt it before the sensors confirmed it. The specific quality of silence that deep space produced when there was something in it that wasn't transmitting but was present. His hands went to the controls before his eyes found the reason. The reason was on the sensor screen 3 seconds later. An asteroid field, dense and slow rotating. The debris of something that had broken apart long enough ago that the pieces had settled into their own lazy orbital logic. Good cover. Bad terrain. Then the second reading. Slave 1, running dark, positioned at the field's outer edge with its transponder off and its weapons systems in standby. The specific hull profile unmistakable on thermal. Fett had a ship with a signature that didn't change regardless of what frequencies he suppressed, because the hull geometry itself was distinctive to anyone who'd seen it before. Han had seen it before. Chewie. One word. The tone said everything else. Chewie was already in his seat. The Falcon systems came up in sequence, shields, weapons, the maneuvering thrusters cycling to warm. Not because Chewie had been told to, because 15 years on this ship had produced a shared operational language that existed below the level of speech. In the cargo hold, against the strut, Vader's masked face turned toward the forward bulkhead. He had felt it 30 seconds before the sensors registered it. The Force, even at 15% of his operational capacity, even running through a body that was spending most of its available energy on the mechanical problem of remaining alive, still processed certain signals faster than any instrument. Boba Fett did not have a Force presence in any meaningful sense. The man was a gap in the Force, a professional absence, but the intent around him was readable. Cold, patient, aimed. He said nothing. He did not have the reserves for warning. He filed it as information and waited. Slave I moved first, not toward the Falcon, across the asteroid field's outer boundary, a repositioning that cut off the most direct hyperspace jump vector. Clean, efficient, the movement of a man who had thought 3 steps ahead while his target was still processing step 1. A seismic charge deployed from the rear launcher, the disc spinning out into the asteroid field and detonating among the rocks, not aimed at the Falcon. Not yet, but demonstrating range, demonstrating patience, demonstrating that the terrain favored the aggressor. The shockwave rolled through the field. Rocks moved. Han took the Falcon into the field. The logic was immediate and not entirely comfortable. In open space, Slave R had the speed advantage and the weapons advantage, and the positional advantage. Inside the field, those advantages narrowed. The Falcon's size worked for her in tight terrain, smaller profile, tighter turning radius, and Han Solo's specific and well-documented pathology about flying through things that other pilots flew around. "Hold on to something," Han said, to nobody in particular, which was his standard pre-flight announcement for maneuvers that did not have names yet. The Falcon went into the rocks. In the cargo hold, the ship's movement translated as a series of impacts against the strut, not violent, not structural, but the constant low-grade physical conversation between the Falcon's hull and the asteroid field's debris, every micro-correction in Han's flight path arriving as a jolt through the floor. Vader's restraint bands held. The oxygen conduit held. The pacer fired its 2-second rhythm regardless. Luke was in the hold. He had not left the hold since the night before, had been in the specific proximity that wasn't quite keeping watch, and wasn't quite something else. He braced against the supply crate and looked at Vader. In the Force, Vader was doing something Luke had no reference point for. He was conserving. The Dark Star presence, already diminished, was pulling inward, not retreating, not weakening further, but gathering. The way something gathers before it is spent. Luke felt it, and did not have the vocabulary for what he was feeling. He put his hand on Vader's arm. Not a decision. The Force moving through him towards something that needed it. The armored surface was cold under his palm and gave nothing back. But in the Force, the reaching happened again. The same involuntary movement as before. The signal underneath the Dark Star frequency. Old and reaching. "The Fett," Vader said. "I know," Luke said. "The Emperor's instruction." "I know. He will not stop. We know that too." Luke's voice was steady. "Han's working on it." The vocoder processed something that was not quite skepticism and not quite faith. The mask faced forward. Vader conserved. Han was working on it. The asteroid field was dense enough to provide cover and problematic enough to require active management. Two facts that were constantly in conversation with each other as the Falcon threaded through the debris. Slave, I was behind them. Inside the field now, Fett matching their vector with the methodical patience of a man who understood that pursuit in terrain like this was not about speed. It was about not making mistakes. Fett did not make mistakes. Han made controlled improvisations, which was a different thing that sometimes produced similar outcomes. "He's going to push us toward the outer boundary," Han said. Chewie confirmed it on the sensor screen. Slave One's movements were not random, were running a subtle geometry that was narrowing their maneuvering options one rock at a time. "He wants us in open space." Chewie had opinions about this. They were correct opinions. "Yeah. I know." Han looked at the sensor screen. Looked at the asteroid density ahead. Looked at a specific cluster of 3 large rocks rotating in a slow triangle, the gap between 2 of them varying between 12 and 40 meters on a 40-second cycle. He looked at the gap. He looked at the Falcon's width. He waited for the 40-meter moment and went through it. Slave, I did not follow. The gap closed to 12 meters before Fett could commit, and Fett was many things, but he was not a man who committed to a 12-meter gap in an asteroid field with the closing speed that would require. He pulled up. Repositioned, the methodical geometry resumed from a new angle. It bought time. Not much. Time was the one resource the Falcon did not have in sufficient quantity. Leia came forward. She moved through the rocking corridor with the balance of someone who had grown up on ships, not smoothly, not gracefully, but with the precise weight transfers of a person who knew how to be on a vessel in motion. She reached the cockpit doorframe and held it. "What do you need?" she said. Han did not look away from the viewport. A different situation. Han. 2 minutes. Whatever I haven't figured out in 2 minutes. I'll take suggestions. Leia looked at the sensor screen. She read it with the speed of someone trained to absorb tactical information in bad conditions. She looked at Slave One's position. She looked at the asteroid field's geometry. She looked at the hyperspace vectors that Fett had closed off. She looked at the one he hadn't. "There," she said. Han looked where she was looking. A jump vector running through the field's densest section, the route Fett hadn't closed because no reasonable pilot would use it. because the debris density in that corridor made a clean hyperspace entry a conditional proposition at best, and a structural failure at worst. Han looked at it for 2 seconds. That's not. It's open. It's open because it's insane. Do you have another option? Han looked at the other vectors. He looked at Slave 1-1's position. He looked at the seismic charge launcher cycling on Fett's rear housing, the next deployment 30 seconds out, the geometry of where it would land and what it would do to the rocks currently providing their portside cover. Chewie, he said. Calculate the jump. Chewie calculated the jump. His commentary on the calculation was extensive and technically accurate, and Han listened to none of it. How long? Chewie told him. Do it faster. The seismic charge detonated. It landed exactly where Han had calculated it would land, because Fett's geometry had been pointing there for the last 4 minutes, and Han had simply been unwilling to concede it until he had to. The rocks on the port side came apart in the slow, catastrophic way that asteroids came apart when their structural integrity was removed. Not an explosion, not a flash, but a spreading, a dissolution. Cover becoming debris, becoming a new and more complicated obstacle. The Falcon shook. Not from the blast. From the rocks the blast moved, secondary impacts along the hull. The sound of the ship being struck by things it was not designed to be struck by. A panel blew in the starboard corridor. Chewie's console threw a warning. The port shield dropped to 60% and held there, drawing power from somewhere that had been providing it to something else. In the cargo hold the sound was loud and immediate. The lights flickered. The oxygen conduit held. The pacer missed 1 beat and resumed. Luke's hand on Vader's arm tightened. Vader's gauntleted hand came up from the floor and covered it. 1 second. The contact. Then the hand returned to the floor and the conserving resumed. The force pulling inward, the gathering continuing. Luke did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the force hadn't already said more precisely. The nav computer beeped. Chewie, already done. The calculation loaded. The jump vector sitting in the system, a route through the debris corridor that the nav computer had flagged with a warning indicator that Han was already dismissing before it finished appearing. Slave, I was repositioning. Fett had read the geometry and understood that his closing option was the debris corridor, that the Falcon was going to run it before he could deploy another charge to close it. He was moving to intercept the exit point, the far end of the corridor in open space, where the Falcon would emerge and be exactly where he wanted her. Han looked at the viewport. The debris corridor ahead, dense and narrow and running at an angle that made the entry approach a matter of precise timing and committed speed. He looked at Chewie. Chewie had the throttle. Hit it, Han said. The Falcon went into the corridor at full burn, rocks scraping the hull on both sides, the ship's frame complaining in every register, the sensor screen becoming useless at this speed and this density. Han flew on the viewport, and on instinct, and on the specific knowledge of this ship's tolerances that 15 years of close acquaintance had produced. The corridor end appeared, open space beyond it, and in open space, Slave 1 waiting. The Falcon came out of the corridor at a velocity that Fett had not calculated, because no one who had calculated it would have entered at that speed, and Fett's intercept position was built on the velocity a reasonable pilot would use. Han was not a reasonable pilot. The intercept was wrong by enough. The jump coordinates were live. Now, Han said. The stars became lines. In the cargo hold, the last thing Luke felt before hyperspace swallowed the asteroid field and Slave 1 in the Emperor's patient geometry was Vader's force presence. Gathered, conserved, pointed somewhere with the deliberateness of something that had made a decision about how it would be spent. The lines became nothing. The Falcon ran. The Falcon dropped out of hyperspace into a system with no name on any civilian chart. A designation in the Imperial Survey database. A string of numbers referring to a K-type star with 2 uninhabitable rocky planets, and a debris field that was the remnant of a third. No settlements, no traffic lanes, no reason for anyone to be here. Han had pulled it from the nav database as a waypoint, a place to stop being pursued for long enough to think, and it had served that function for 40 minutes before the sensor screen showed what the debris corridor jump had cost them. The port shield generator was failing. Not failed. The distinction mattered, because failed was a fixed state, and failing was a clock. The battle damage from the asteroid field had done something to the primary emitter housing that the secondary systems were compensating for, and the secondary systems were not designed to compensate indefinitely. The screen showed the draw increasing in increments. 2 hours, maybe 3, before the compensation cascade reached the limit of what the Falcon's power grid could sustain. Han looked at the screen, looked at Chewie. Chewie told him what the repair required. It required going outside. The EVA took 45 minutes. Han and Chewie in the airlock, suits on, the specific efficient silence of two people who had done dangerous external work on this ship before, and had developed a procedure for it over 15 years of necessity. Leia monitored from the cockpit. Luke stayed in the cargo hold, with Vader. The ship was quiet in the way ships were quiet when most of the crew was outside it. The drives at minimum, the systems at standby, the constant mechanical complaint of the Falcon reduced to its baseline murmur. The oxygen hissed. The pacer fired. Through the cockpit's external viewport, if Luke had been able to see it from the hold, the K-type star cast everything in deep amber. Vader was awake. He had not slept. Luke was not certain the jury rig's current state would allow sleep, was not certain what happened to the cardiac pacing if the body's rhythms shifted toward the patterns of rest. He had been awake for hours, conserving. The force gathered inward, the dark star presence pulled to its minimum expression. The gathering had not dispersed after the hyperspace jump. Luke sat on the supply crate and felt it in the force and understood, without being told, that Vader was holding something in reserve. Something specific. The intention behind the gathering was not passive, it was aimed, the way things were aimed before they were spent. He didn't ask, he sat with it. Vader spoke first. "The Emperor will not stop," he said. Not a repetition of the asteroid field observation. This was different, slower, the vocoder working through something that was not tactical analysis. Not for the ship, not for Solo. "I know," Luke said. "He wants you." The mask, facing forward. Both of you, the bloodline intact. He has plans for it. Luke was quiet for a moment. In the Force, the gathered energy held its shape. "What kind of plans?" "The kind that require patience," Vader said. "He has always been patient. It is his primary weapon." The pacer fired. The oxygen hissed. "He waited 30 years to destroy the Jedi," Vader continued. The vocoder's cadence was doing something Luke had started to recognize. The slight change in rhythm that meant the performance of Darth Vader was entirely gone and what was speaking was something older and more damaged. "He will wait 30 more. He has no urgency. He has only architecture." "But you do," Luke said. Quietly. Not an accusation. An observation. The mask turned toward him. "I have," Vader said, "approximately 2 hours of viable jury rig function remaining." Luke went still. "The emitter draw is increasing. Your pilot knows this. He has not told you because he does not know how." "How do you?" "I have been feeling the power fluctuations through the pacing unit for the last 40 minutes. The vocoder. Flat and precise. Every fluctuation in the Falcon's power grid fires slightly wrong. I have been counting them." Luke looked at him. At the mask, at the armored figure against the strut, at the hands resting still against the floor in the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided not to reach for anything. The gathered force held. "Vader, Anakin," he said. One word. The first time. Quiet as the ship around them, carrying 23 years of disuse in a single syllable. Luke did not move for a moment. Then, "Anakin." The sensor alert fired from the cockpit at the same moment Luke felt it in the Force. 3 ships, the specific hull profiles on thermal Eta-class shuttles, the Imperial variant with the extended cargo bay that the Emperor's Shadowhand wing used for personnel transport, coming out of hyperspace at the system's edge, which meant they had tracked the Falcon's exit vector from the asteroid field with enough precision to narrow the destination cone to a single system. Fett's trajectory scanner, feeding the Emperor's assets. They were 12 minutes out. Luke was moving before the alert finished sounding. Into the corridor, toward the airlock, keying the comms. Han, we have. I see it." Han's voice through the suitcom, tight and immediate. 2 minutes to reseal the emitter housing. Do not let Chewie come back in before I say so. Han, they're 12 minutes. 11.5. 2 minutes. Don't touch anything. Luke went back to the cargo hold. Vader had not moved. But in the Force the gathered energy had shifted. It was no longer inward. It was facing the direction of the sensor alert, aimed at the edge of the system where 3 Eta-class shuttles were running approach vectors. How many sovereign protectors per shuttle? Vader said. Not a question. Luke answered anyway. I don't know. 6 per shuttle, standard configuration. 18, plus his shadow agents, 2 per wing, cortosis weave weapons. The vocoder processed something. The cortosis will interfere with lightsaber contact. Do not open with a blade. I wasn't planning to open with anything, Luke said. Han is. Han cannot outrun 3 Eta-class shuttles with a failing port shield and a power grid at 70%. Luke did not answer, because it was true. I can, Vader said. You can barely, not for long. Flat, clear, the precision of a man describing a mathematical reality rather than making a claim. A sustained expenditure. Complete, everything remaining. The Force around him was very still. Once, Luke understood what he was saying. He understood it the way he understood things in the Force before he understood them with his brain. The shape of the intention, the direction of the gathered energy, the specific terrible clarity of what Vader was proposing. You'll die, Luke said. Yes, there might be another. There is not. Not cold. Not performed. The voice of someone who had spent 40 minutes counting power fluctuations and had arrived at the only calculation the variables supported. I have run the alternatives. I am telling you what I have found. The hold was very quiet. Get your sister, Vader said. Leia came because Luke asked her, and because the ship's current situation left no room for the objections she would otherwise have raised. She stood in the cargo hold doorway, the same doorway she had stood in for Chewie's surgery, for the argument, for the confession, and looked at Vader with the expression she wore when she was doing arithmetic on something she did not want the answer to. Vader looked at her. I will not ask you to forgive me, he said. I have been told there is not enough time, and I think this is probably accurate. Something moved through Leia's face. The architecture held. I am going to do one useful thing, he said. I wanted you to see it. Leia was quiet for a long moment. Then, why? Because Padem would have wanted a witness. The hold breathed. Leia stepped inside. She did not sit. She stood with her arms at her sides and her hands still, and she looked at him with the honest, complicated expression of a woman who had carried 2 billion dead for 2 years and was about to watch the man responsible for them do the only thing that could matter now. She stayed. The Sovereign Protectors came out of the shuttles fast. The Falcon was stationary, the EVA reseal complete, Han and Chewie back inside. The port shield at functional but not full capacity. No room to run. The shuttles had bracketed the approach vectors with the efficiency of a unit that had trained for exactly this kind of containment operation. Boarding tubes extended. The airlock took the first contact. Han had his blaster. Chewie had the bowcaster. Luke had his lightsaber, held low, remembering what Vader had said about the cortosis. The first protectors came through the airlock in pairs. What followed was not elegant. It was the confined, close-range, brutally unglamorous work of fighting in a corridor that was 1 person wide, against opponents who were armored and trained in carrying weapons that had been specifically designed for this encounter. Han fired from the far end of the corridor. Chewie provided the kind of suppressive presence that made tactical repositioning difficult. Luke worked the gap between them, the lightsaber used as deflection rather than offense, pushing, redirecting, buying the seconds that the math required. They held the corridor for 4 minutes. The second shuttle's team breached through the cargo bay lateral hatch. Luke felt it in the Force a half-second before it happened. The new presence, the flanking angle, the geometry collapsing into something that the corridor defense could not accommodate. He turned. There were 6 of them, already inside, moving fast, and the angle was wrong. He heard Leia shout. He heard Han fire. He felt Vader's gathered force presence release. It was not a lightsaber technique. It was not a combat form or a trained application. It was a father interposing himself between blaster fire and his children, and the force answering that with everything it had available. The 6 protectors in the cargo bay stopped moving. Not slowly, not under the influence of careful, sustained telekinesis. All 6 simultaneously, mid-stride, held by a force grip that operated at a scale Vader had not been capable of since before Mustafar. A complete expenditure, every remaining reserve, drawn through a body that was not equipped to channel it and did so anyway. The Falcon's power grid flickered. The oxygen conduit hissed at irregular pressure. The pacer missed 3 consecutive beats. 6 seconds. Long enough for Han to fire from the doorway. Long enough for Chewie to clear the angle. Long enough for the corridor defense to close. Then the grip released. Vader's hands dropped to the floor. The oxygen hiss changed character. Irregular. Wrong. The conduit losing its seal from the sustained physical effort of a body that had spent everything. The pacer fired once. Missed. Fired again. Leia was at his side before Luke reached the doorway. She was on the floor of the cargo hold next to the strut, one hand on his arm, the position of someone who had not decided to be there and was there anyway. Vader's masked face turned toward her. He did not speak. He did not have the reserves for speech. But in the Force, available only to Luke from the doorway, Luke, who was very still. The gathered presence finished its release. Not the dark side. Not the cold architecture of Darth Vader. Something older. The signal underneath. It reached toward Leia. It reached toward Luke. It did not reach anywhere else. Han Solo, at the corridor end, still holding his blaster, watching what was happening in the cargo hold, went very quiet in the specific way that Han Solo went quiet when he had no framework for what he was looking at. He did not lower the blaster immediately. Then he did. He crossed the cargo hold and knelt next to Leia without deciding to. Nobody spoke. The Falcon's systems ran. The star outside cast everything in amber. The pacer fired its 2-second rhythm into the quiet, and every person in that hold listened to it without knowing they were listening, marking the seconds by the only clock that mattered now. The Falcon's corridors in the aftermath had a specific quality of silence. Not the silence of emptiness. The ship was full, all its people present and accounted for. The systems running at their usual register of complaint and function. The silence was the kind that followed something too large for immediate processing. The air in every compartment carrying the residue of what had happened in the cargo hold, without having a vocabulary for it yet. The drives hummed. The starboard corridor rattled. The port thruster had opinions about the EVA repair that it was expressing at low volume. Han and Chewie worked. The boarding breach in the lateral hatch needed sealing. The protector's entry point had compromised the cargo bay's atmospheric integrity, and that was a problem that did not wait for emotional processing. Han ran the patch kit. Chewie ran the welder. The work was systematic and quiet, and required enough concentration to justify not saying anything, which was the condition Han currently required most. Luke assisted. He handed things when they were needed, held panels when they needed holding, performed the supporting work of someone who understood that work was what the moment required, and that questions could wait until the work was done. Leia was in the cockpit. Not flying, the Falcon was holding position in the unnamed system, the EVA repaired port shield stable at 83%. No traffic on any sensor. She was in Han's seat, which was where she went when she needed to be somewhere that wasn't a room with other people in it. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the K-type star through the viewport, at the amber light it cast across the instrument panel, at the debris field that was all that remained of whatever had broken apart here long enough ago that nobody remembered what it was. She was letting herself feel something. It did not have a name yet. She was not going to force a name onto it before it was ready to have one. She had spent 2 years naming things. Grief, rage, purpose, the functional architecture of surviving what the Death Star had done. And she knew what happened when you named something before it was finished becoming what it was. You ended up carrying the wrong word for the rest of your life. She sat with the unnamed thing and looked at the star and let the Falcon's sounds do what they always did, remind her that the ship was intact, the systems were running, and the people inside it were alive. All the people who had been alive before the cargo hold were still alive after it. She sat with that too. It took 40 minutes to seal the lateral hatch properly. Han sat back on his heels and looked at the patch. Clean enough. Functional. The kind of repair that would hold indefinitely if you didn't ask too much of it. He wiped his hands on his jacket because the rag was in the hold and he was not going back to the hold yet. He looked at Chewie. Chewie looked at him. The communication that passed between them in that look had no words attached to it and didn't need any. Han stood up. He walked the length of the corridor to the cargo hold entrance and stood in the doorway. Vader was where he had been. Against the strut, the restraint bands still in place, nobody had removed them, and nobody had asked whether to, and Vader had not indicated a preference. The oxygen conduit had been reseated by Luke after the expenditure. The seal had partially gone during the force grip, the effort of channeling that much through a body in this condition doing what physics said it would do. The pacer was firing. The oxygen was flowing. The holds were different after the protectors. The crates Han had been using as cover in the lateral breach approach were displaced. 2 of them overturned, the contents scattered. A black scorch mark on the floor from a protector's weapon discharge that had gone wide. The amber light from the corridor fixture catching the edge of the armor, the helmet, the stillness of a figure that was running very near empty. Han looked at it for a moment. Then he walked in and sat down in the pilot's jump seat, the fold out on the port wall, the one Luke used sometimes on long transits when he wanted company but didn't want to crowd the cockpit. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at Vader across the hold. Vader's mask turned toward him. The silence held for long enough to establish that neither of them was going to fill it with something inadequate. Then Han said, "You didn't have to do that." The vocoder. Quiet. The cadence that was not Vader's cadence, no. You could have let them finish us. Yes, why didn't you? The pause. The pacer fired once, twice. The oxygen hissed at its steady low pressure. "They are my children," Vader said. Han nodded. This was the answer he had expected, and it was a complete answer as far as it went, and it did not go far enough to explain the specific thing Han was sitting with. And you, the vocoder processing the deliberateness of what it was constructing, each word placed rather than released, you fought for them. With nothing. Han looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I respect that," Vader said. Han Solo had been many things in his life and had received many things from many sources, and had developed, over 30-odd years of living in spaces where respect was currency, a precise sense of what the word was worth depending on who was spending it. Crime lords. Rebel generals. Senators who needed his ship and expressed their gratitude in operational terms. He had been respected by beings whose opinion he had actively sought, had filed the respect away as useful, had moved on. He did not know what to do with this. He looked at the mask for a long moment. Then, "I'm going to respect the hell out of you right back and not say what I'm thinking." Something in the vocoder, not breath, not quite. The jury rig didn't allow for that, but adjacent to it. Something that existed in the register where a laugh would have been if the equipment had allowed. "Wise," Vader said. 2 men in a cargo hold in an unnamed system. The star outside running amber through the hull seams. The pacer firing its 2-second rhythm into the quiet between them. Han stayed where he was. Luke came in and sat on the floor beside Vader, cross-legged. The way he sat when he was being present rather than performing presence. The way he'd sat on Tatooine on the ridge above the homestead, watching the binary sunset go down and not trying to make it mean anything beyond what it was. He didn't meditate. He didn't apply any formal structure to what he was doing. He was simply in the space, the Force open, offering what it was possible to offer, the specific gift of being there without requirement. Vader felt it. Luke knew because of the way the Force shifted around the figure against the strut, not dramatically, not with the sudden quality of a dam releasing, but the way a held breath releases when someone realizes they have been holding it. After a while, without words, Luke understood. He stood. He walked to the cockpit and stood in the doorway until Leia looked at him. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with language. She stood. She came with him. Leia stood in the cargo hold doorway. Han was still in the jump seat. He looked at her and looked at Vader and made the quiet calculation that this was not a moment that needed him in it, and stood, and walked out. He touched Leia's shoulder as he passed, briefly, the contact lasting less than a second, saying what it said. She walked in. She did not sit immediately. She stood 3 meters from the strut and looked at the mask, and the mask looked back at her, and the hold held the weight of everything that had been said in it and everything that hadn't. Vader spoke first. "I know you will not forgive me," he said. "You should not. Alderaan is mine to answer for. It is not yours to carry." Leia's jaw was set. Her hands were still. "I am sorry," he said, "that you have been carrying it." The oxygen hissed. The pacer fired. "I do not ask you to grieve for me," he said. "Be angry. It is the correct response. But do not let it be all you are." Leia stood with this for a long moment. The unnamed thing she had been sitting with in the cockpit shifted in her chest, moved, did not resolve but changed shape into something that had a little more room in it. She said, "What was she like?" "Our mother." Vader was quiet for a moment, long enough that Luke, in the corridor outside, held very still. Then Vader told her. Not the story he had told Luke. Luke had received the facts, the sequence, the history laid out in the order it had occurred, because Luke was someone who needed to understand what had happened. Leia received the feeling, the interior of it, what it was like to know Padmé Amidala from the inside of loving her. He told her about the laugh, the way it arrived late, like she had weighed whether to allow it and decided yes, the laugh of someone who had learned early that public life did not reward spontaneity, and had chosen to be spontaneous anyway, privately, in rooms where it was safe. He told her about the arguments in the Senate, not loud, never loud, conducted at the level of moral precision that made the opposing position feel like a personal failing in the person holding it. He told her Padme had never raised her voice in a formal session. She hadn't needed to. He said, she had her mother's eyes. He had said this before, the first time he had seen her in the cargo hold, and he said it again now as a different kind of statement. Not observation but acknowledgement. Not what Leia looked like. What Leia was. He said, her mother's nerve. Her mother's absolute certainty that the world could be made better by the people who refused to accept it as it was. Leia finally sat down. She sat on the floor of the cargo hold, 3 feet from the cargo strut, and listened to her father tell her about her mother for the first time in her life. She did not cry. She got more specific. She asked questions, precise questions, the questions of someone who was going to carry these answers carefully and wanted to make sure she was carrying them right. What did she read? What did she argue about with Palpatine before she knew what he was? Did she know she was going to have children? Did she choose the names? Vader answered everything he could. What he couldn't answer, he said he couldn't answer. Simply, without apology. The hold filled with Padmé Amidala, her presence building in the specific way that people who are gone become present when the right person tells the right stories about them. She was there in the cargo hold of the Millennium Falcon, in an unnamed system, in the amber light of a K-type star. She was there in the careful way Leia held her questions, and the deliberate way Vader shaped his answers, and the force that moved quietly between them. Old and complicated and trying. The jury rig failed piece by piece, not all at once. The way light left a room when clouds covered the sun, gradual and then, at some threshold, complete. The oxygen flow thinned first. Luke, in the corridor, felt it in the force before the equipment showed it. He came in quietly. He crouched beside the strut. He looked at the lower face guard. Vader said, "Open it." Luke opened it. Not the whole helmet. The lower guard only. The section covering the mouth and jaw. The destroyed flesh. The scarring. The evidence of Mustafar that the suit kept hidden from the galaxy for 23 years. Vader breathed real air through the opening. Irregular, shallow, the effort of lungs that had been dependent for so long that independence was something they were doing for the first time. Real air. "Tell her she was right," he said. His voice without the vocoder, raw, damaged, barely above the threshold of audible, carrying everything the machinery had been suppressing. To fight. All of it. She was right. Luke looked at him. "Tell her I said so." Then the pacer missed a beat. Then another. Then the oxygen thinned to nothing, and the hold was breathing on its own again, and the armor was still, and the Force presence that had been a dark star in Luke's awareness since before he knew what the Force was simply departed, not violently, not dramatically. The way a hand released something it had been holding for a very long time, when it was finally, after everything, ready to let go. The armor was empty. In the corridor doorway, Han Solo stood and looked at what the cargo hold had become. He took in the empty armor, his friends on the floor around it. The quality of silence that the hold now held, different from the silence before, final in the specific way that only one thing was final. He was not a religious man. He was not a Force-sensitive man. He had maintained, across a career of close acquaintance with the Force and its effects, a professional opinion that the Force was an elaborate explanation for good luck, and that good luck was something he understood without needing it mystified. He didn't know what to call what he was looking at. His shoulders dropped. His chin found the angle. The gesture lived in his posture rather than his hands, the motion of a man removing an imaginary hat, the oldest gesture of acknowledgement available to someone with nothing else to offer. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then, quietly, to his ship and his friends and whatever remained in that hold that was worth speaking to. "Okay," Han Solo said. "Let's go home." Chewie fixed the motivator in the quiet that followed. 4 hours of work, methodical and unhurried, the specific patience of a being who understood that the ship needed attention regardless of what had happened aboard it, and that giving it attention was the most honest response available. The Falcon did not care about the cargo hold. The Falcon cared about fuel lines and motivator housings and the port thruster's ongoing editorial about the EVA repair. Chewie addressed these things in sequence, in the amber light of the unnamed system, while the K-type star moved through its indifferent arc overhead. Nobody slept, but everyone rested, in the way that people rested after something they did not have words for yet. The specific stillness of a crew that had collectively exceeded its processing capacity and was waiting for the capacity to return. Luke sat in the common area with his eyes closed and his hands open in his lap. Not meditating in the formal sense, not reaching for anything, not attempting to organize what the Force was showing him. Just present. Letting the Force move through him without directing it, the way you let water move through your hands when you stopped trying to hold it. Leia made plans. She sat at the Dejeric table with a datapad she had found in Han's storage compartment and wrote in the precise, structured shorthand of someone who had been trained since childhood to convert experience into action. Not the experience itself, that went somewhere else, into the place she had built for things too large for immediate use. The action. What the Alliance needed to know. How to say it. What it meant strategically, operationally, for the shape of the war going forward. She wrote for 2 hours, and the writing was not grief management, and was not avoidance. It was the most honest thing she knew how to do with something real. Han fixed things. He moved through the ship with a hydrospanner and an inventory of damage from the asteroid field, and the boarding breach, and the EVA repair, and the power draw from the cargo hold's final hour, and he addressed each item in sequence, because addressing things in sequence was how Han Solo processed experiences that did not have a category. He fixed the blown panel in the starboard corridor. He reseated the connection the port shield emitter had been complaining about since Florum. He tightened the docking collar seal that Luke's X-Wing had stressed on arrival. He worked until the ship was as right as he could make it. At some point during the 3rd hour, he realized he was grieving. He sat with his back against the starboard corridor wall, hydrospanner in his hand, and acknowledged it for approximately 45 seconds. Then he picked up the spanner and went back to work. Because the acknowledgement was enough, and the Falcon still had opinions about the motivator coupling that Chewie hadn't reached yet. While the Falcon drifted, the galaxy was rearranging. Not dramatically. Not with the clean, decisive quality of a story that knew it was ending. The Empire was vast, and inertial, and did not fall in 4 hours, did not fall in 4 months, would fight with the specific terrible momentum of a thing that had been built to sustain itself against all challenge. But certain things were true now that had not been true before, and true things had consequences regardless of whether anyone had processed them yet. On the Executor's Bridge, Admiral Piet issued 3 orders in succession, and had two of them countermanded by a sector Moff, who had been waiting for a gap in the chain of command, with the patience of a man who had been patient for a long time. The Moff's countermand was challenged by a Grand Moff who outranked him and disagreed on strategic grounds. The disagreement propagated through the command structure at the speed of imperial bureaucracy, which was the speed of fear, very fast when fear was directed from above, very slow when the direction was absent. The paralysis that had started in a Cloud City dining room was propagating upward. On Coruscant, Palpatine was managing things directly for the first time in 20 years. He found it what he had always found it, beneath him, and exhausting, and evidence of the specific failure represented by the destroyed chest box of a supreme commander who had let a smuggler get within 4 meters. He was reaching simultaneously across hundreds of officers, hundreds of command nodes, the web of his influence doing work it had been designed to delegate. He was not diminished by it. But he was occupied, which was a condition he had not operated under since the early years of the Empire, when the architecture was still being built and he had to touch everything himself. He did not have time, in these 4 hours, to do anything else. The rebellion had been given a gift that looked nothing like a gift. It looked like 4 hours of imperial command confusion, of countermanded orders and propagating paralysis, and an emperor too occupied with direct management to be applying his attention to the things that actually required it. 4 hours was not victory. 4 hours was a crack in a wall that had looked, until a smuggler fired a blaster in a dining room, like it had no cracks. The crack was there now. It would be enough. Not today, not this year, but eventually it would be enough. Slave I filed a contract completion claim through the Emperor's private contractor channel. The claim was specific and professional. The contract had specified recovery or elimination. The asset had been eliminated by circumstances that Fett's intervention had been unable to prevent, given the operational timeline and the Falcon's hyperspace departure from the asteroid field before interdiction was complete. The elimination had occurred. The fee was owed. Fett attached the sensor logs from Slave One's trajectory tracking as documentation. He did not pursue the Falcon into the unnamed system. The math did not support it. Han Solo was now something the math had not previously needed to account for, a rebel hero at a scale that made the original bounty irrelevant, as a practical matter, with the political protection that came from being the person who had been present when the Empire's supreme commander died. Pursuing Solo into that context, without a contract that priced the operational complexity correctly, was not something Boba Fett did. He closed the file. He pointed Slave One at a transit corridor with better commercial prospects and ran the calculation on 3 other outstanding contracts, none of which involved anyone who had recently shot Darth Vader. He did not feel anything about Darth Vader. He never had. That had always been the point of Boba Fett, the professional absence of feeling. The gap in the Force that was not coldness but simply the complete organization of a self around function rather than investment. Darth Vader had been a client relationship and then a variable in a calculation and then a completed contract. The accounting was clean. Slave One ran its transit corridor. The stars moved. Fett ran his calculations. The file stayed closed. The Falcon reached the Rebel fleet rendezvous 6 hours after Chewie finished the motivator. She came in without fanfare, without the triumphant approach of a ship returning from victory. She came in the way she always came in, slightly rough on the approach vector, the port thruster still editorializing, the hull scoring from the asteroid field visible in the fleet's running lights as she crossed into docking range. She looked like what she was, a ship that had survived something it hadn't been built for. The fleet was a Home One Command frigate and 6 escort vessels, holding position at the coordinates that changed every 72 hours, because the Empire was still looking, and would keep looking. Mon Mothma and Admiral Akbar were on the dock with a full tactical staff. They were expecting a report. They were going to get one. The docking collar engaged. The airlock cycled. Leia came down the ramp first. She was still in what she had been wearing in the Cloud City dining room, scorched now, the fabric carrying the specific evidence of everything that had happened since: asteroid dust, the residue of the lateral hatch breach, the indefinable quality of a garment worn through something that had aged the person inside it in ways that had nothing to do with time. She looked like someone who had been through an experience that did not have a name yet, and had decided to name it herself before anyone else did. Mon Mothma looked at her. The tactical staff looked at her. Nobody spoke immediately. Han came down the ramp. He was carrying one object. Vader's helmet, removed from the empty armor before they left the unnamed system, the only portable piece. The only thing that said specifically what had happened rather than requiring explanation. He crossed the dock without ceremony, without speech, without any of the performance that the moment might have seemed to require. He set it on Mon Mothma's planning table. He stepped back. The silence in the dock was the same quality of silence as the Cloud City dining room. Not the silence of shock, not the frozen, unprocessed silence of beings confronting something their categories could not hold. The silence of understanding. Of a room full of people doing the same arithmetic simultaneously and arriving at the same answer. Mon Mothma looked at the helmet. She looked at Han. She looked at Luke, at the bottom of the ramp, and at Leia, who had moved to stand beside him. Her voice, when it came, was the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years of her life building toward a moment she had not been certain would arrive, and who understood that arriving was not the same as winning, and who was going to need every detail of the road between here and the next thing. "Tell me everything," she said. The accounting was brief and specific. Leia delivered it. She spoke for 11 minutes, in the precise structured shorthand of her 2 hours at the Dejeric table, converting experience into actionable intelligence with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this since she was 19. What had happened? The sequence. The variables. The current state of the Imperial command structure based on what Vader had told them, and what the sensor data from the asteroid field had shown, and what a careful reading of the pursuit response suggested about the paralysis propagating through the fleet. Mon Mothma listened without interruption. Akbar listened without interruption. The tactical staff took notes. When Leia finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Akbar said, "The Death Star construction schedule." "Continues," Leia said. "The Emperor is still alive. The fleet is still intact. The war continues." A pause. But the grip has loosened. For the first time since Yavin, we can see the path. She did not say, because of what happened in a cargo hold in an unnamed system. She did not say, because a man who had done the worst things the galaxy had seen in a generation chose, at the end, to put himself between his children and the people who were coming to kill them. She did not say it. She carried it. The room absorbed what she had said, and began the work of converting it into plans. That was what rooms full of people committed to something larger than themselves did with true things. They converted them into the next action, and the next, and the next, until the actions added up to the thing they were building toward. The galaxy was not saved today. It was cracked open. The light that came through a crack was not much light. It was enough to work by. The Falcon sat in the docking bay. Hull scored, engine worn, with the fresh docking collar mark from Luke's X-Wing and the lateral hatch patch, and the specific look of a ship that had recently been through something it was not designed for, and had done it anyway. She looked, in the bay's fluorescent light, like herself, like exactly what she was, which was a ship that had been through everything, and was still here. Inside, through the cockpit viewport, one light, Han Solo at the controls, running no calculations, going nowhere specific. The nav display showing the fleet's position and the hyperspace lanes beyond it, and the rest of the galaxy beyond those, all of it open, all of it waiting, the specific condition of everywhere that mattered, and nowhere in particular. He sat for a while in the quiet of the ship. He thought about the cargo hold. He let himself think about it, the full accounting, the specific details, the way the light had looked and the way the sound had changed, and the way Leia had sat on the floor, and the way the empty armor had looked when there was nothing left inside it. He let the accounting run until it finished, which took the time it took, and then he sat in the finished quiet of it. He had not meant to save the galaxy. He had meant to survive Bespin, which had been his only goal when the dining room doors opened. Everything after that had been survival logic, one decision at a time, each one following from the last with the specific inevitability of a man who had a rule below the level of articulation that people did not die on his ship. The galaxy was apparently better for it. He would accept that. He would accept it with his usual precise lack of sentiment. The sentiment existing underneath the precision the way it always had. The way it always would. The way he had always hoped nobody noticed and suspected everybody did. He had shot first. Through every version of the story that would be told about what happened in the Cloud City dining room, and stories would be told. He knew. Because this was the kind of thing that became a story immediately and stayed one. He had shot first. Before the decision, before the calculation, before any of the things that followed. His hand had moved, and the bolt had gone under the palm, and the rest of it had followed from there. Some things didn't change. He reached for the controls. Not toward anything specific. Just forward, the way the Falcon always went. Badly, brilliantly, just enough. The light in the cockpit stayed on. He shot first. Everybody always forgets that. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.